Hamas, because the demand of Hamas and the demand of Fatah is different. Like Hamas continuously demand extreme stuff. For example, they don't want Israel to be called as a country. They want an access to Jerusalem. And these are things, ladies and gentlemen, have affected like all small peace deals that could have established. Like, for example, what are the areas that you should not be targeting, right? These are areas that we are sacrificing because Hamas continuously break down the negotiation. As a result of continuous negotiations being broken down, how has it affected the people on the ground? West Bank, ladies and gentlemen, is losing critical mass. The most important individuals are already moving out of the country and settling somewhere else. This means that the people on the ground don't have the people they need to fight for their cause. As a result, ladies and we need that identity to be clear and not to be concluded with a hostile Hamas. Thank you very much.
Please, sorry. Yeah, we fix this.
Sorry, the technicians are working on it, so just pause for a little bit.
Yeah, the speaker or whatever is annoying.
Yeah. That's all makes sense now. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Let's go to the later.
Because the demand of Hamas and the demand of Fatah.
You know the setup is faulty when it's based on entirely false premises. A few things that we need to question. Firstly, this is their setup and the problem that they want to solve. The negotiations have continuously failed because of the existence of Hamas. Because say it's not necessarily a war, but will provide security for people, especially those in the West Bank and Israel. But what does security entail? If you are talking about what is happening in Gaza and Israel right now, when they're constantly firing bombs at each other, security would mean that you have to be military aggressive. Security would mean that you have to add on your defense. You can't just put up walls and barbed wires and say this is the security that we want. No, thank you. Thirdly, the premise of their case is that no Hamas, no peace. Therefore, we have to take out Hamas. But the question is this: what happens to the people in Gaza? What happens to those people who chooses to support Hamas? Because whatever you might say, Hamas was the legitimately elected government in Gaza and people them. Are you going to drive these people over to West Bank to secure them, or what are you going to do? I'll take one from opening.
We both know that a unity
compromise the statehood legitimacy of any dream that Palestine will want to secondarize Hamas and make them even more dangerous. Let's establish this. Hamas is a legitimately elected government. The reason they were elected in the first place is willing to back against its own people and attack Gaza, we think the conclusion is this, that you compromise all possibilities of having a united Palestinian front, and
Madam,
you compromise the trust of your people and your long-term legitimacy. Yes.
Madam, since you have conceded that this is a hostile Hamas, and there's a divided support on the ground, how will this how successful have you been in these negotiations?
We think the fact that there was an attempt at forming a unity government between Hamas and Fatah shows that those progress can still happen. But how do you radicalize Hamas even more when you take those things? As I told you, Hamas was initially not as crazy, not as radical as they are. They were elected into government and only started building tunnels, only started bombing Israel when they are under attack. And the most pernicious thing is this. The premise and propaganda that they are running on right now is that Israel wants to wipe out Gaza. That's why we have to be aggressive. That's why we have to use human shields. That's why we have to stay into civilian homes to protect our own people. That's why we have to channel all the funding for the people into military spending. When you tell Fatah to join US and Israel in this endeavor, you're giving more legitimacy for Hamas to say, hey, the world is, we need to strengthen our army. It is okay to sacrifice welfare and people on the ground and food or security for people on the ground because we need to safeguard our borders. We think the information warfare is thus indoctrinating people, telling them, the Gazans, that no one is for us. We have to be aggressive. We have to be even more radical. And we think all those things are very, very bad. We are very proud to oppose.
Yeah, we need
All right, let's thank you, Mr. Shalita, and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
to be clear and not to be concluded with a hostile Hamas. Thank you very much.
This characterization coming from opening opposition. Let's deal with a lot of those first to clarify what the actual setup is for this debate before we move on first. We heard that Gaza was never the reason why negotiations have failed, and that more important was the expansionist policies and the right of return issues that Palestinians all face. While we agree those are definitely important issues on which deadlocks have been reached, a critical part of the peace agreement was the guarantee of safety for Israelis. When Hamas joined the unity government of Fatah, this is what threatened that even further. The possibility of achieving peace was only present when there was at least some negotiation going on with Fatah. The reason why the negotiation broke down, as pointed out by the opening opposition leader, is because of that unity agreement. So therefore, Hamas and joining up with Gaza is the reason why the peace agreement broke down. We're saying we need to separate that unity agreement back on track with only negotiating with Israel and the US to better achieve peaceful outcomes. Because here's the second point of mischaracterization that came from them: that Hamas is somehow not so radical now, but will be radicalized under this model. That is completely ridiculous. Hamas is the most radical it has ever been now, and the reason for that is because of the desperation of the Gazan people. That will be a lot clarified even further my substantive, but suffice it to say for now that if all these suicide bombing attacks, if all the rockets that are being launched, despite innumerable odds that you already said that it's asymmetrical war, there is no chance they're going to be able to defeat Israel, why do you think they're still launching these attacks? Because they feel that they have no other option under their side. We change that dynamic when we force them to, when Fatah is only negotiating with Israel and Palestine, and things in Fatah end up getting better. I'll talk more about that later on. But finally, let's talk about how, the final point, if Hamas Israel now, this will send out a message that Fatah is the aggressor. We're therefore forced to be militant under our side of the house. We don't believe we have to necessarily attack Gaza and attack Hamas in order for us to fulfill our burden on this side. When we say collaborate, we mean work with Israel through economic development, through better negotiations on land agreements, through the better negotiations on the right to return for Palestinian citizens, easing up free movement within the West Bank in particular. These are the things that we're talking about collaboration and the reason why it's important is because these benefits will only accrue to the West Bank insofar as Fatah is the one that's negotiating with them. And the reason why this is important is because it sends a message to Gaza that these are the benefits that you can accrue if you negotiate in a peaceful manner. This is how we bring down Hamas and take away the legitimacy that the people have given them and move it forward to a newer government that will negotiate under good faith. Have a seat. So what am I going to talk to you about in today's debate? First, why the current status quo is something that is untenable and we cannot maintain. Secondly, how do we change the legitimacy that comes from the people? And finally, why will Israeli people, Israeli government, and the US as well by definition, to go for this particular deal? The status quo now is that this war is never ending. What we have is a humanitarian conflict that flares up every couple of years, where Israel feels the need to go in and mow the lawn in Gaza. This sprouts out newer generations of terrorists and Hamas militants every single time they do it. So even to the only measures of peace that are every time there is a ceasefire and there's somewhat of a measure of peace, that is destroyed the moment that Israel goes in and has to fight against Hamas, because Hamas feels that it has no other choice but to attack Israel. And the Gazan people feel the same way, which is why they've given their support to Hamas in that regard. So the reason why Hamas was able to get like the majority of the vote in 2006, which was like 7 years ago when they had that election, is because they felt that there was no other option for them, because they see that in the West Bank, this situation there is almost just as bad. Sure, there may be somewhat more of a measure of like economic uplift that's going on there, but the freedom of movement is blocked. There is no fair justice system that they get there. Palestinians are denied the right to go and visit their family members within Israel. They're consistently harassed and degraded and have no sense of dignity or humanity within the West Bank, living on their own lands and continually encroached upon by Israel. When they see that the alternative is negotiating means that kind of meager existence, they would rather die and fight and shoot rockets and vote for Gaza than to negotiate with Israel. When we therefore prove under our side, when the Fatah negotiates with Israel in good faith and works with them openly and says, these are the type of things that we can achieve when we work with you, this is when we change things on the ground. So this moves me to the second argument, how we change the legitimacy from the people. Before that, go ahead.
If aggression is what is causing Hamas to shoot fire at Israel, how would turning Fatah against them alleviate the problem?
That is my next argument. So legitimacy that has changed from the people is really important now, because when they see the West Bank flourishing as a result of giving legitimacy to Fatah, it takes away legitimacy from Hamas. When people in Gaza see that everyone in Fatah a beautiful existence, when the wall is taken down, when their fair rights are being given, when there's a guarantee of peace for both Israelis and Palestinians living in that area, when there is at least a freer movement of goods, of trade, of information and technology and economic development that happens in Fatah, it is in Israel's interest to assist the West Bank in building these things up. But when it does that, it gets the guarantee from Fatah that it will not work with Hamas in return. This is why Israel needs to do this, because now the blame in Gaza will shift now from being on Israel to Hamas. Sure, Gazans aren't going to love Israel in the US now, but what they will be able to say is this: look, the comparative is that if we do negotiate with them, we have a better life. We're able to get jobs. The blockade is lifted. We're able to fish off of our own lands. We're able to farm closer to we don't have to go within 3 kilometers of that stupid fence. We can't even farm on arable, fertile land that they have taken from us. That is the alternative and the comparative that we offer when we show them what Fatah can achieve and the incentives that Israel and the US working collaboratively can actually give them. That is why peace will be better achieved, and we take away support from Hamas in the process. Why will Israeli people also support this? Because they are tired of war. They are simply tired of having to go in and send their own soldiers to die. Every time a soldier gets captured or killed, it is like another bullet in the heart of every single Israeli citizen, because they value their Israeli military so much, because they have to send, because it is a draft military where everyone has a family member within the military, or at least has served at some point in the past. They don't want to keep sending these people to war, and they don't want to live under the fear of rocket attacks, live under the fear of war. So they want to be able to stop these soldiers dying. Additionally, the info sharing that can happen between Fatah and Israel, something that is only beneficial on our side. When Fatah splits off from Hamas and unequivocally denies any form of support for these terrorist organizations, this is when legitimacy from the rest of the world will also be given towards Fatah as a result of this as well. Info sharing between Fatah on the activities of Hamas, to the extent that it knows them, on the military capabilities of Fatah as well, will also be shared as well between Israel and Fatah. At the end of the day, legitimacy is from the people of Gaza is the key thing that needs to be changed. If we can show a comparative advantage of a life of dignity for the Gazan people compared to the life that they live now under constant fear of election, and they will rebel, and eventually change in a long-lasting peace will definitely happen. We're very proud to propose.
Okay, let's thank the Deputy Prime Minister. I welcome the. Yeah.
Madam Chair, side opening government assumes a lot of things. They assume that suddenly the West Bank will be given statehood and negotiations will be dramatically better once you allow them to bring down Fatah, because negotiations have been going on even without Hamas. The 1970s, 142 negotiations, where the Egyptian negotiations happened, it's a lock to what has happened between Israel and Palestine. So what makes you think that if Fatah suddenly attempts to bring down Hamas, negotiations will be dramatically better, the state of West Bank will flourish with economic and technological development, which is so absurd and so assumptive on side opening government in today's debate. They also neglected a huge chunk of the demographic, which is important to discuss. The Gaza people. What if these people do not want to flock to the West Bank? What if these people wanted to stay in their homes? The same way they remain in their homes, even when Israeli troops came in to bring them down, they still stood their ground. They still think there is some dignity. In the process, so it's in US and Israel's best interest come to the table to discuss. And we think that it's also disgusting that the very fact that Israel is sabotaging the Hamas and Fatah government now seems to be an excuse for them to now say that Hamas and Fatah should not collaborate at all. In fact, they're the ones who are collaborating with the aggressor now. To say that I am pandering to your threats of sabotaging the peace agreement, therefore I will side with Israel. That legitimizes any moral legitimacy. We are not willing to side with the party, i.e. US and Israel, who attempted to sabotage these peace talks just because they wanted to alienate and break down the Palestinian people. We think that they also need to answer the moral question of alienating a significant portion of society. We think because Fatah, at the end of the day, is a political party. We think that if you say that you will bring down another political party just to achieve a goals and ends for you securing power, that's the perception that people will think of you. People will think that the only reason you want to bring down Fatah is to secure your political power within the Palestinian people, regardless of listening
Hamas propagates an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic notion within the people of Palestine, who are their neighbors, right? So that anti-Semitic position within the further fear with the people of Israel. So what happens then? We say then Israel's oppression attacking Gaza more and more on the fear of Hamas's existence. But more importantly, really alienate these people. On the analysis that most of these people only stay there because have no other option. But who are the kind of people who will still remain rooted in that place despite getting a better option in West Bank, as proven before? The kind of people who are likely to buy into Hamas's rhetoric of anti-Semitism, kind of people who are likely to buy into murder and directly getting children up front to act as a human shield, right? So we say those kind of people, even if alienated, we should remain alienated, because these kind of people will never be able to unite Palestine as a whole. They'll always promote violence. They'll always make Israel feel like they're threatened, right? So we say those kind of people don't deserve that form of unity. If you think they'll provide any form of unity, no. Then they tell us that there is a moral legitimacy which cannot break apart Palestine. We say Palestine currently is divided into people who are extreme and divided into some people who are extreme and the other people who just want their basic human rights, right? Palestine currently is already divided. Only way in which you can unite them is get rid of those great extremist people and bring apart the peaceful humanitarian ones that can come forward and bring the government together. But more importantly, the secondary purpose that they have is that democracy is not being fulfilled because the government will be, because the people will see as the government to be inhumane government, right? This is an absolutely fallacious argument. When a government comes and gives you all the support that you need, gives you a better water, better living circumstances, make sure that you're not getting attacked every single day. We say the government in no way does create a threat in the people's mind. But before I move on, yes, sir.
Supporters of Hamas are not necessarily blood-born terrorists. They are also grandmothers and children and aunties who are supporting Hamas. Are you also willing to alienate this portion of people, normal people in society?
Understand what is the rhetoric of Hamas. Hamas claims to be mothers and that without Israel is a bad entity that tries to kill you. Israel is not that. It creates an anti-Semitic picture. Just that picture on its own is wrong. So even if you're feeding such a wrong picture into these people's mind and thus the people are supporting you, the support on its own is wrong. Anywho, let's talk about the people of Israel and the international context of this chaos. We've seen this chaos go on forever and ever. But why does this go on? Because presidents like Netanyahu get elected in every election forward. Why do these presidents get elected? Because of the people in Israel. What is the content of the people or the citizens of Israel? Citizens of Israel have suffered through attacks throughout their entire life almost, because they've suffered through anti-Semitic attacks during World War II and further on. We say this kind of mentality that remains. The reason why Israel was formed was to protect itself, because they always feared, and fear was their primary tool of creating a state. We say as long as this fear is being propagated by Hamas, what it does is it keeps the people, the ground root people of Israel, supporting such an extreme government in Israel. What happens then? When people understand the propensity or the context of the situation, they the prime ministers such as Netanyahu, who keep attacking Hamas forward. We make sure that the people of Israel feel safe. Thus, not supporting a government who is who keeps measures. The Hamas needs to be removed. But more importantly, suffering that Hamas remains legitimate. As soon as there is further suffering within Hamas, the dilution of these human suffering in the international community is because of Hamas. Hamas is attacking Israel back. So we say as long as this dilution remains, the people within Israel neither will ever pressurize the government to move forward to a peaceful scenario. People who can change the system right now are not only the people of Palestine and but also the people who need to change the system. So what have we given to you? We first told you why the concept of anti-Semitism that is being propagated by Hamas is not legitimate, and if you're still supporting it, you're likely not of a sane mind. More importantly, majority of these people are not Israel, they're just pro-peace, right? So they just really need a safeguard. But more importantly, we've broken down all their points about whether these whether it really alienates individuals, whether it's
Madam Speaker, it seems that the entire government bench premise is that Hamas is still this crazy extremist party, and it's not sure. We think this is intuitive, and it's going to be the biggest clarification of our case. Let's first recap.
Like Hamas created exactly because Israel attacked. You have the first intifada, you have the second intifada, because Israel is continuing its attack on the West Bank, on the Gaza, because Israel is the one who is constructing open air treason, because Israel is the one who is constructing all of the blockade. And that is why Hamas quoted
like they actively try to defend people on Gaza and on the West Bank. That is why we say the popular will for Hamas is much more compared with the popular will for Fatah. If you only have a Fatah government which have limited support on the domestic politics, on the domestic political system, it's really not enough for you to have more bargaining power to negotiate with Israel, because ultimately you don't really have much popular support within even your own domestic citizens. And that is why we say you need the support that Hamas has been giving. You need the people who support Hamas, because Hamas is the one giving them money, Hamas is the one giving them healthcare, giving them Medicare. We think that this part of popular support extremely important in negotiating with Israel, and that is why Israel will care about even trying to negotiate with Palestinians in the first place. No. Second thing I want to talk about is that why even assume Hamas is really bad. It's better under our side to moderate Hamas. We think that Hamas becomes extremist. Hamas becomes militant because they don't really have other alternative, right? They have to go extremist exactly because and we only think that Hamas can do is just to be extremist so as to have popular support. But on the our side, when you put it on the democratic system, they need to win the votes, not just votes in Gaza and West Bank, but the votes coming from the entire Israel. And we think that there's actually quite like different mentalities coming from the Israeli citizens. You have quite a bunch of Israeli citizens who don't want to go extreme, who don't want to go militant, and the nature of you can moderate the nature of Hamas exactly because they need to win the hearts and minds of the entire Israeli citizens. And that is why we say even assume that Hamas is really bad and it's really militant. It is only by